Hi, this is Andy Kaufman. Thank you for joining me for this video episode of the People and Projects podcast. I hope you've had a great week. Today I'm in downtown Chicago and it's the last class of an MBA quarter, so it's the last day I have with a cohort. It's a project management class. Interestingly, it's a healthcare MBA, so the vast majority of people in the class are physicians and people who don't necessarily think of their work as projects. And so one of the really fun things over the course of this quarter is seeing their eyes open to how everything in life is a project, in many ways, right? And so the final papers were due today, and just reading through them, watching people say, this was eye-opening. And one person said, it's been life-changing. And interestingly, one person said that because of our conversations about culture, he realized in his case that the place where he was working, that culturally it just wasn't going to work for him. The way that things got done, that it just was not going to work. And so he was in the process of interviewing at another place. And a question that came up during the interview was, let's say that the head of our company makes a decision that a certain product, it's a product-related company, this product needs to be delivered earlier than what was planned. So you had plans and now they're inflicting change on it. How do you deal with it? And so this is a guy who's not a product manager or a project manager by trade, but because he went through the learning this quarter, he remembered our discussion about constraints and how, change is expected, change is not the enemy, but we have to kind of think this through, and that there are competing constraints. Chances are you've heard of the project management triangle or the triple constraint. So that came to mind, and he said he came up with an answer that was something along the lines of, we can do that, but there are trade-offs, and we'd have to look for reallocating things here, look at those trade-offs. Anyway, the person who was doing the interviewing, she's like, that's a really good answer. And she goes, hey, would you come and talk to some of the rest of our people over here? So right after that part of the interview, he's asked to come over to another group of leaders that are already hired there. And she goes, all right, I asked him this question, and this is how he responded. And everyone's like, yeah, there are trade-offs, and we could use these ideas as we negotiate with customers. And so in many respects, it is such basic project management. Anybody that's doing project management that has some training related to this understands that there are trade-offs, right? They're just trade-offs, and there's competing constraints. This led to him getting a job offer. And so, of course, that just made my day, right? And so what's just been wonderful to see is how when you really get project management, what you realize, and I don't care if you're more agile or more waterfall, what you realize is that everything in life is a project, and you can apply these lessons. I mean, most of the papers, what they said was the biggest lesson wasn't Gantt charts or some methodology. Some of the biggest lessons they're taking away are the requirement of building relationships with people, that everything comes down to relationships and influencing skills and understanding who our stakeholders are and thinking through change management with stakeholders. So anyway, it's just been a really satisfying end to the quarter. And can I just remind you that, everything's a project. And try to take what you learn, certainly on the podcast, but what you learn in your projects, and apply it in other areas of your life. Speaking of other areas of life, in this last week, I had an opportunity to just take some time away from work. My speaking schedule in the fall is pretty nuts, and so I'm trying to find time in late July, early August to take advantage of pockets of availability. And I've got a really good friend who got me into cycling some years back. And he goes, how about we ride from Chicago to Peoria? Now, if you're from the Midwest, that may mean something to you. If you're outside the Midwest, it's not that big of a deal. But, it's like if you drive it, it's like 170 some miles. And he and I have done it one time before. But my personal mileage on the bike is really low this year. And so it's not like I've built up the strength to do this. But as he and I were talking about it, the thought came, what if we invited my 16-year-old daughter to join? Now, my 16-year-old daughter, she's a wonderful person, but she's never gone more than 18 miles ever on a bike. she's like never done a long distance. And so I pass it by Krista, that's her name, and she's like, let's do it. And so on Tuesday and Wednesday of this last week, we get on a bike in Algonquin, Illinois, and we whip out 92 some miles the first day, and we end up going 162 or something like that in total. But here's kind of an interesting lesson from that experience is you could argue in some ways, I talked about how everything in life is a project. You could say in some ways that life is just filled with stories, right? And what are the elements of stories? Certainly there are characters and there are scenes. If you saw the podcast episode with Kathy Salett, she kind of riffs on this idea. But even on a bike ride, there are characters, right? So if you knew my friend Fred, he's a character, and I love the guy. And Krista, without all this experience, she's set, right? So now we've got a plot issue, and there's the excitement of the start of the ride, and with stories there are plot twists, and there's conflict, which is the hills, and even on the first day, it was Illinois is reasonably flat, for the in the scheme of things, but there's our butt hurts, and there's the challenge of this trail is closed, and how do we get around it? Well, interestingly, first day at the end of 92 miles.
Workout finished.
It's like, yeah, we're sore and we're tired, but it felt awesome. Even after getting drenched in rain and there was lightning and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it was still a really cool experience. Slept well that night. The next day, even though we only went 60 some miles, it was a lot harder. There was more uphill. And, good stories have that point which they call it the dark night of the soul, right? This is when it seems like all is lost. And I got to tell you, because I've done this ride before, I knew when it was going to hit. And it's in about the last 3 hours of the ride when you still got a long ways to go. And I know this route, and there's just more uphill than down. Your butt hurts and your legs are tired. And my daughter, I was just so proud of her. She hung in there. But there were times where she's just like, I know what she's thinking on the inside. She's like, this is stupid. Why did I sign up for this? But we came to this point where there was a road that was called Low Point Boulevard or Low Point Street or whatever. And she and I looked at each other and like, As it turns out, there's a town in Illinois called Low Point. Can you imagine living in a town called Low Point? Well, we were both feeling it, man. But we eventually got to this one town, and I just knew that once we got there, the rest of it's pretty easy. It's got a wide shoulder from there. It's the last 7 miles. And sure enough, during that last 7 miles, just watching Krista crank out, I mean, at what for us was a pretty high speed, and there's, good stories have the climax at the end, and we ride into the place that we're going to be there, and this feeling of victory. I just invite you to think of projects are a story. Certainly life is a story. There's going to be the uphills and the downhills, and as much as that sounds like a cliche, I'm telling you, there are the moments in the projects that's like the dark night of the soul. Right? And it just feels like all is lost. We're not going to be able to deliver this thing. You know what? A lot of the battle when it comes to stuff in life, as well as in our projects, certainly on a bike ride like this, it's right here. It's right in the head. How do we think about it? How can we mentally stay in the game to realize this will get better, or to keep things in perspective, or to crack a joke about Low Point, Illinois? I'm telling you, it's if you can think of life as a grand story, and how do you navigate through that and keeping perspective, it can make such a difference. Well, you know what? If there's any lesson related to that, that is, at least when this is recorded, right? It's August. It's early August still. And you've got a month here to go before, in many parts of the world, school starts up for kids, the rhythm of life starts changing, and you've got a couple weeks here to take advantage. In my case, I had the blessing of being able to hang out with my daughter and a really good friend for it, but how can you use the rest of this month to kind of like recharge, take a big deep breath before you dive in again into the fall? Think about that. Well, you know what? Thank you for being a listener to the People and Projects podcast. That's a little bit what's gone on with my week. I'd love to hear what's gone on with your week. Send me an email, and I'd love to hear from you. Well, thank you for joining me for this video episode of the People and Projects podcast. Have yourself a great week. Freaky fast.